And we're so excited that MercyCorps is here with two guests from Somalia. I'm going to let Madeline introduce them and tell you a little bit about the program as well. Madeline Rose from MercyCorps. But we want to talk about, you're here to present findings on how we can reduce violence. And this is really important because this is something that I think a lot of the organizations around the table, a lot of the AfP partners are looking at. How do we talk differently about peace building, conflict prevention, and how do we show that we can actually measure our programming and show measurable impact to especially the policymakers that decide on funding levels and programming. So this is just it's a really important presentation, and I'm really excited to see all the interest. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Madeline. So thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Thank you, Alliance for Peacebuilding, for hosting. We're really excited about this study, and just to jump right into it. So, we all know each other pretty well, but MercyCorps, just for folks who may be less familiar, we were founded in 1979, but we, in the early 1990s, incorporated into MercyCorps the Conflict Management Group, which was a small alternative dispute resolution and conflict resolution shop that was started out of Harvard. And so we actually incorporated them into MercyCorps and started looking at how do we use kind of our tools and our mission as a humanitarian organization and start to mainstream conflict resolution into humanitarian and development practice. And so I think at that point was when we sort of absorbed this third hat, which is a peacebuilding hat. And I think our as a community, we've all kind of spent the last 2 decades really thinking about, how do you blur these lines between humanitarian development, peacebuilding? Is it one and the same? Where are they separate? Where are they integrated? And how do we know what actually works to reduce violence? Is it pure development, or is it peace building? And which actual interventions in which contexts can reduce violence sustainably and can transform conflict environments? So we have sort of a long track record of research on the topic of particularly drivers, so what drives violence, and have not had the opportunity to, in the last few years in particular, people in the policy community have responded to sort of say, okay, you've done enough work on the drivers, we want to know what works. And so we've spent the last 18 months really figuring out where within MercyCorps' kind of current operations we could do a rigorous impact evaluation to try and answer that question. And this was sort of the first pick. So I'm going to let my colleagues take it from here. But Beza Tesfaye is our research manager for conflict and governance globally. So sort of any of our studies, Youth and Consequences, Investing in Iraq's Peace, from Jordan to Jihad, kind of all of our biggest pieces in this space, Beza has led on the research methods and models and analysis. And she's based here in DC with me. And then Faisal Osman is our lovely external visitor. So he is our civic engagement specialist in Somalia. He works across 3 different regions, from Mogadishu, Kismayu, Hargeisa. He bounces around overseeing this program, as well as many others. And they are going to give an overview kind of the original program goal, theory of change, design, and then the actual methodology and research methods of what we were able to find. So thank you, everyone, and to you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you guys for coming. I will be very brief and quick to the point, explain what this program is and what our findings mean for the whole practitioners, policymakers, and the communities that we targeted with this research. So if I can just go straight to my presentation, we would like to learn the lessons we learned from one of our longest running programs in East Africa, in Somalia. Basically, SYLI, Somali Youth Learners Initiative, is a 5-year USAID funded program that has been running throughout Somaliland, South Central, in Puntland, and the new emerging states right now. So SYLI basically focuses on different interventions, but the most important ones that we looked into this study are 2 main interventions. They are education programming and civic engagement. So those were the 2 main interventions that we targeted in this research. One of the reasons why we said the motivation for this study was actually, as Madeline just highlighted, what works in terms of reducing violence. There's a growing body of research and improvement in understanding the drivers of violence or political violence, but there has been little work on what works, what strategies, what interventions do actually work, and how do we measure that, and how we learn lessons so that we can improve in our future programming, in our future youth interventions. So basically, that was one of the main motivations that led MercyCorps to undertake this rigorous study that we have conducted in Somalia. Another motivation that pushed us to look into this research was there is a threat of violence in Somalia. This increasing recruitment of Al-Shabaab in some parts of the country, but also there is a stability that has the risk of potential risk of sliding back to violence again. So the country now is at a critical juncture. Youth account for almost 75% of the country. That's the largest population for Somalia. And engaging them in a program that addresses some of their needs was one of the ideas that was behind the design of the SYLI program. That's a 5-year USAID program designed to contribute to Somalia's stability through specific interventions through education and civic engagement. So the other thing that motivated us also is Somalia government came up with a national strategy to prevent, an action plan to prevent violent extremism. But they have two main pillars within that strategy, which is providing education to youth and also providing civic engagement. So this research actually complements the findings, complements to that strategy. And the lack of evidence that I talked about was another motivation that pushed us. So the context we're talking about, you have the largest population of Somalia being 75% youth, most following the collapse of the government in 1991. The schools were taken over by private institutions. So there were very limited opportunity for youth to go to school. What SYLI did basically was to provide education to those who cannot afford to go to school that's private. So we have constructed 22 schools in Somaliland, 17 schools in Puntland, and 21 schools in South Central Somalia. That brings us to a total of 60 schools. So all 60 schools, 50% of them receive education and other support, but 50% of them, 30 schools, around 30 schools receive civic engagement and education. So the research looked at what's the difference between those who receive education and those who receive civic education combined with education, access to secondary education. In other words, is there a marginal effect when education is combined with civic engagement opportunities? So I talked about SYLI, the overall goal of SYLI is to contribute to Somalia's stability through education and reduce the appeal of violent extremism. So I want to talk about a little bit about the designing of the program and how we looked at the original design. Education is a double-edged sword. That when we found out in our research that when we provide education to youth, we are actually raising their expectations. They're gaining skills, they're getting skills, they're getting knowledge, but we are not completing that. We are leaving incomplete. That raises their expectation. If those expectations are not met, then it turns into grievances. Those grievances can, if they are not met, they can turn into frustration. It motivates them to participate or support violence in that case. However, when we combine that education that we provided with civic engagement opportunity, and by civic engagement opportunity is to prepare them for life of purpose, giving them the skills to utilize that knowledge. let me just briefly explain how the civic engagement component works. It's basically we have developed a curriculum for civic engagement at the school level. So we select student leaders. They go through a very comprehensive training, civic engagement training. Once they complete that training, then they come up with action plans. They develop an action plan. They mobilize their peers and they implement small-scale projects at the school level or at the community level. It's all youth-led. They feel satisfaction. They feel empowered. They feel that they are part of a community. They feel that they understand. We teach them their roles and responsibilities. We teach them leadership. We teach them about conflict resolution, and they take ownership of that process. They implement programs at the school level, but also they implement programs at the community level. They identify all the critical issues that are affecting them, and they use, basically, the civic engagement gives them the platform to exercise their knowledge. They do all this on their own. In some of the schools, we piloted those programs. We initiated to conduct one activity at the beginning, but it has come something that they have adopted. They do it on a weekly basis on their own, and it has become part of the school curriculum. So in the education component, what we do basically is we work with the federal government, Ministry of Education, the community educational committees, and we identify schools in target communities who are vulnerable, where we have large population of youth without opportunities. And then we construct either a new school, or we go back to revive or rehabilitate an existing school that has been collapsed during the civil wars or the other conflicts that followed afterwards. So what happens basically is that once we construct the school, we provide the furniture, we provide training to the schools, we provide teaching and learning materials to improve the quality so that they can be competitive to the other schools that were constructed and supported by the private network institutions that run the private education in Somalia. So those were the two main components that we have looked at in this research, and we found some very interesting findings and very positive in some cases. And I would like to give to my colleague to tell us about what this whole research means for us, what are the findings, and policy-wise, what will be the implications of this program.
Thank you, Faisal, and good morning, everyone. So as Faisal mentioned, the objective of this study was to evaluate the impact of this program and to really understand what is the effect of education and the effect of education combined with civic engagement activities. So when we set out this research, we had 5 hypotheses that connected these two interventions, or this intervention, the education intervention, and the combination of education and civic engagement to violence outcomes. So our overall hypothesis was that the program would decrease both participation and support in political violence, including violent extremism. And the mechanisms that we hypothesized would link the interventions to the outcomes are what you see here. So we're looking at, for example, perceptions of government, how the program affects perceptions of government providing services adequately. We're looking at the level of youth isolation and exclusion that is affected through the program. We looked at optimism about employment outcomes. We looked at agency and a sense of empowerment, being able to make a difference in one's community. And lastly, we looked at the belief in the effectiveness of nonviolent actions to affect change. So a brief summary of the methodology. As I mentioned, this was an impact evaluation. So unfortunately, we didn't have the ability to randomize and do a full randomized control trial. So what we did was the second best option, I think, which is essentially a quasi-experimental impact evaluation. We had a control group of about 300 youth who are out of school, and we compared them to similar youth who are in schools through the SYLI program. And we made sure that these two groups were comparable by matching, essentially matching them on demographic and other socioeconomic characteristics and variables. So we were very sure that these two groups were very similar on most aspects, besides the fact that some of them were given the opportunity to participate in the program and others were not. We then selected our sample by first identifying schools that were either just implementing the educational activities or implementing the combination of education and civic engagement. And after we had selected the schools, we then randomly selected the students inside of those schools, as well as the out-of-school youth from the surrounding communities. And we did this randomly. And then because the survey that we did was asking young people about very sensitive issues like their level of participation in violence, their previous support for extremist groups, for example, because we were asking very sensitive questions, we decided to use essentially some survey experiments, which is a technique. These are techniques to ask questions that are sensitive in a more indirect way. And if anybody's interested, I can get into the details of that. But all of our outcomes, our main outcomes, were measured both indirectly and directly. So now I'll just go through the key findings from the research. The first thing that we looked at was the effect of just access to education on violence outcomes, just education by itself. And surprisingly, we found that although giving youth access to secondary education reduced their use of violence or their participation in violence by roughly 16%, it simultaneously increased their support for political violence by close to 11%. So this was a bit surprising for us to see. We sort of assumed that support for violence would also go down as participation in violence. So to really understand what was going on, we looked more closely at the mechanisms, the hypotheses that I mentioned to you. And the first hypothesis, as I mentioned, was the role that perceptions of government had to do with this. We assumed that by having access to education, people would have more positive perceptions of their government, which would then lead them to not support violence. When we looked at this specific mechanism, again, we were a bit surprised because although being in school, access to secondary education improved young people's perception of government in terms of the provision of healthcare, as well as water and electricity, when it came to the provision of education itself, we found that young people who were in schools were about 34%. It's okay. They were about 34% more likely to believe that the government was not adequately providing them with a quality education, as well as security, about 19% more likely to believe the government was not doing enough in terms of providing security. The second and third hypotheses that we looked at, as I mentioned, were young people's sense of optimism in terms of having future employment opportunities, as well as their level of isolation and exclusion. And here again, we were a bit surprised because when we looked at the effect of education on optimism about future employment prospects, we saw again that it had actually a negative effect. So young people who were in school were about 16% less likely to be optimistic about future employment outcomes. And this is not very surprising because the unemployment rate in Somaliland, for example, is close to 75%. So even if you are educated, it's still very, very likely that you're not going to have access to a job. And it seems that youth who are educated are more cognizant of this reality and might be more frustrated because of it. When it came to isolation and exclusion, however, young people who were in schools were about 15% less likely to feel excluded and isolated and marginalized in their community. So that was something in line with what we had hypothesized. So to summarize the key findings around education by itself, we found that youth who were in secondary schools were less likely to be satisfied with the government's provision of education. they were less likely to feel optimistic about future employment prospects. And again, these are two things that were counterintuitive to sort of what we had predicted. But they were also less likely to feel isolated and excluded in their communities. So given these results, we kind of better understood why youth at the same time might participate less in violence as a result of being in school, because they're less vulnerable and excluded and marginalized, so they're therefore less likely to be recruited into violent extremist groups. But at the same time, because they're more frustrated in terms of they don't think the government is adequately providing access to education, or they feel like they don't have future employment prospects, that frustration might be driving their support for political violence, even though they might not be actively engaging in it at the moment. So then we looked at the effect of education combined with civic engagement on violence outcomes. And here we see that overall, civic engagement and education reduces both support and participation in political violence. And this reduction, as you can see, was pretty significant, about a 20% decrease in terms of support and a 14% decrease in terms of political violence. And again, the two graphs include both indirect and direct questions. So we wanted to understand why it was that civic engagement, the addition of civic engagement, reduced both participation and support. So we looked again at the mechanisms or the hypotheses that we had. And the first one, as I mentioned, was this idea that civic engagement might actually increase young people's sense of agency and empowerment and the belief that they can make a difference in their community. And we saw that, again, the combination of these two interventions, education and civic engagement, actually improved the belief that young people could make a positive difference in their community, and that they actually had a responsibility to do something positive in their community. Thank you. And then the last hypothesis that we looked at was whether the combination of education and civic engagement actually made young people believe that nonviolent action was an effective way of making a difference instead of actually using violence. And again, here we saw that the civic engagement activities made young people more likely to believe that they could affect change through things like discussing concerns with a community leader, or raising an issue in a group, or complaining to a local official. And they were also more likely to have employed those types of nonviolent actions once they had gone through the civic engagement activities. So to summarize these findings, youth who were in secondary schools and involved in civic engagement activities were more likely to think that they can make a positive difference in their community. They were more likely to have engaged in nonviolent civic actions. And importantly, they were more likely to believe in the efficacy of nonviolent civic actions to affect a positive change. So to conclude, generally what the research was telling us was that the combination of formal education and civic engagement seemed to be more effective at reducing both participation and support for political violence, including violent extremism. And some of the policy implications and recommendations this sort of led us to were, first of all, youth programs that are trying to address the drivers of violence amongst youth specifically, have to address both the lack of skills that youth are facing, as well as the lack of opportunities to employ those skills and to do something meaningful in their lives. So a lot of the programs that we implement, education programs, vocational training, and so forth, are really dealing with the skills, the lack of skills side, but there also has to be opportunities created for young people to employ those skills and to make a positive difference. Another key implication, I think, which is not here, but generally that we found from this, is that some of these programs that we're working on right now, development programs, preventative programs, are actually having an impact on changing attitudes and behaviors related to violence. And so we feel like, this is just one study, but it's sort of giving us evidence to show that our long-term preventative efforts can actually make an impact in terms of violence reduction. So a lot of the CVE work that's going on is actually, in our view, worthwhile and making an impact. And then last but not least, we are seeing that it is possible to test and evaluate these types of programs, and that there is a value in trying to measure outcomes like political violence and see what kind of effect our programs are having. So we think it's important to continue to invest in measuring and evaluating the effect of such programs. So I'll leave it there and open it up to questions in the room and also on the phone if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, just to add one more point to supplement that last point, I think it's very important also for us to articulate well that why are we focusing only in Somaliland? There is violence going on in the southern part, but we have focused this study particularly in Somaliland. Yes, so the reason why we focused Somaliland is because we have been working in Somaliland the longest. It prepared the program ready for a study like this one. But we are trying to replicate whatever we have done in Somaliland to the southern and central part of Somalia to see if our hypothesis and theories of change still hold in those areas as well. So in Somaliland, we specifically focused on political violence because there's no violence related to CVE, although it has some effects in Somaliland, but it's not to the level when compared to the southern and central part of Somalia. So political violence and by extension, gang violence, other clan conflicts and other violences related to that motivate young people to be engaged in acts of violence. That's the point I wanted to clarify, but we are also planning to replicate this study with a new grant that we won recently from USAID, and we are trying to conduct a similar study in South Central Somalia in the coming few months, as I can highlight.
David, can you?
Yeah. So first off, thank you. This is terrific to see. A couple of the questions that I had, I think you just answered. As you move this study out of the one area, one of the things that I would be curious to see is the perception. The question that occurs to me as you're talking about this is that the perception of what government is, which government, is going to change from region to region within Somalia. And I'm curious to know how much of the results you're getting are actually referring to the perception of a unified Somali state government versus a regional Somaliland government, whether or not, and this would be a real nuance, but where you're looking at government is providing basic services, does that mean actually the government is, or the government is an entity that can and should be? There's two different ways of looking at that. The other thing that I was thinking of is some of the pieces that you were describing as counterintuitive. This, to my mind, is the history of leftist terrorist movements over the last 100 years. That leftist violence tends to come out of education. They're based within universities where once upon a time the biggest recruiting grounds for violent movements. So I'd be curious to see comparisons between what you're talking about here and, for example, Northern Ireland would be a great example of a place where the most recent round of troubles back in the 60s, beginning in the 60s and 70s, had its origins in the first group of college-educated Catholics in Northern Ireland who were coming out without the civic engagement, without the possibility of employment. They had the education, but not any of the other things that usually go along with that. That's the various groups throughout Europe in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the Red Brigades, the Baader Meinhof guy. I mean, all of them had exactly this kind of a background that you're talking about. So I'd be curious to see some comparisons there, because we have examples of this sort of dynamic happening, but what we don't have a whole lot of is the experimental studies saying this is exactly how the interaction works. So any thoughts on that, or whether it's something that could be combined with this, I'd be curious about.
Sorry, did you introduce yourself? Just folks could.
Sorry, this is David Alford with Safer World.
Faisal doesn't know all the words.
Yeah. Actually, thank you very much. When we looked at governments, we were basically looking, for example, this study was very particular to Somaliland. And Somaliland in some way believes itself as separate from the rest of Somalia. So when we're working in Somaliland and the Somaliland administration, we work with them as if they are the entity there providing services to its people. Mm-hmm. And actually, when we were interviewing, we were basing all the questions that we were asking the kids or the students, the parents. Just to mention that in our interview, it was basically quantitative and qualitative. In the quantitative analysis survey, we included the students, both the treatment and control. But in the key IIs, the key interviews, the key informant interviews, what we did basically was we were interviewing government official, we were interviewing teacher, we were interviewing students who gone under the civic engagement program or student leaders. So we were asking them basically questions to relate it to their particular government, local government, and the services they provide. So the perception was basically coming from that. To compare this study with other studies, or maybe MercyCorps has been building an evidence base and conducted several other studies, including in Yemen, including Colombia, Nigeria, Somalia, and other locations. Sometimes it's very expensive to carry out and measure and come up with results if this is really something that's working, that's worth investment, future investment. Sometimes it's very difficult to secure funding for measuring all the programs that we are implementing. During the design of each program, we try to include all the lessons that we learned so that we can change some of our programs. For example, in the 2013 study that we conducted in Somalia, Yemen, and Afghanistan, told us a lot about how our programming needs to change and how we need to modify our programming. So it may need more resources to invest in, look at like what happened back in the 60s in Ireland, so that what lessons can be derived from there and be included into our future programming. It's something that's very encouraging.
Something not to lose.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I guess just on that second question, the reason why we wanted to look at education, I think, is because the literature is kind of mixed. You know, there's some research, I guess, from places like Ireland and Europe that show the more educated you are, like the more revolutionary or rebellious you might be. And then there's some literature that says when you lack access to education, it's basically the greed, I guess, sort of argument that if you lack access to basic services like education, you're more likely to engage in violence. We thought this literature was really mixed. And it's interesting because Al-Shabaab, when I was reading a bit about Al-Shabaab, they employ both strategies. Like in Kenya, they do recruit university graduates, for example. And in Somalia, a lot of their recruits tend to be uneducated, vulnerable, orphaned, poor. So
You get multiple ends of a spectrum. I mean, historically, if you look at that, the leftist groups tend to come out of education. The more fundamentalist rightist groups tend to come out of a lack of education. Even there, however, the design, command, and control level of those groups tend to come from a more educated background, while the foot soldiers come from a less educated background. So It's important to differentiate all of those and take a look at it.
I think I had a question.
Hi, I'm Cindy Klapwinsek. I do learning and evaluation with Alliance for Peacebuilding. Really impressive. Such an interesting study to do. As Faisal started to talk about doing it with political violence and not super active hot violence, I look forward to seeing how you will move these studies. Doing high quality quasi-experimental design in a super active conflict has got to be a challenge. So I look forward to seeing how you do. I do have a specific question, which is that you studied education and then education plus civic engagement. You didn't do civic engagement on its own, and which I kind of understood until you got to the conclusion, the second bullet on the screen, opportunities for civic engagement should be coupled with formal education. And I was wondering what the basis for that conclusion was.
So the reason why we didn't look at civic engagement by itself is because there weren't any places where we were just implementing civic engagement. It was sort of combined, and I think also because of limited resources. The recommendation is essentially, I think Faisal can speak more to how we see these findings informing some of the education policies in Somalia more broadly, but what we're saying is that education by itself might raise these expectations, might create grievances in young people if they're not also being able to act on their, use their skills and engage in some kind of positive work or activities. So formal education, we believe, should also produce opportunities for young people to engage civically at the same time. So that's why we're saying there should be a coupling of these two as much as possible.
So you hadn't meant to imply the converse, because arguably what we don't know for sure is whether or not civic engagement alone, what kind of effect it would have.
Yeah.
So if I just by traveling throughout the regions and talking to students in schools and teachers and people who are implementing all these civic engagement and educational activities, what we found out was, and also within our research, is that education, when you provide education alone, on its own, you're giving them skills. Their expectation goes up. They want something. They want to utilize those skills and apply something. They don't have that. That's what the frustration, when the frustration comes. But when civic engagement, if you provide, of course, civic engagement without education, you just taught them just civic education, but you didn't give them the educational skills and tools to that would have been the foundation before implementation. Because civic engagement is more like of the implementation of what they learned, is giving them the opportunity and the platform to implement small scale projects. It's like going internship after you graduate. Now you're starting while you are in school, coming up a proposal, a small proposal, because you are trained on a specific skills, for example, conflict resolution, action taking or action planning, how to develop a small proposal. And then we model through these small scale projects, transparency, good governance, all those good principles and values in those small scale projects that they come up with. After the training, after each training, we provide them post-training support and coaching. Because the assumption is, which is actually an assumption, if there is no education, then they cannot even use the civic engagement skills that we provide them. So it was something that without civic engagement, or maybe without education, we would come to maybe a different conclusion. But the assumption is that since we talked to the students and they were more satisfied, they were feeling more a sense of community, a sense of agency, that what they learned in education, they are feeling that their non-violent actions are actually making difference in the community or at the school level.
If I could just add one more thing on the policy, it's a good point that maybe we should flip the language of the finding and then say, opportunities for formal education should be coupled with civic engagement, and vice versa.
So that other people don't go down.
Yeah, so it's a good point, and I appreciate that. Though I will say, when we were working on the recommendations, where we've done large-scale youth programming globally, one of the biggest problems that we've found, which I'm sure everyone will agree, is sort of the elite network, only sort of the elite kleptocratic youth in urban centers really get the benefits of civic engagement. And so as Somalia is rolling out its national CVEPV strategy, one of our other recommendations in the report, and something that we're working on the ground, is to help empower and bolster support for the Ministry of Youth within the national CVE strategy. So the youth minister and the ministry will have sort of resources and domain to implement the civic engagement and the education pillars together so that it's not siloed. So as they think about geographically where they're going to implement this new strategy, there's a fear that we have that sort of civic engagement will be for the already educated, and then education will go to the uneducated, and there won't be the integration of both investments for all communities. So I think that was also part of what we were thinking.
Hi, my name is Aaron Chassie. I'm with Catholic Relief Services, where I'm the Director for Equity, Inclusion, and Peacebuilding. Thank you very much for your presentation and for really solid work. This is exactly the kind of empirical work that we need, I think, in order to advance our learning in this field. Your findings made a lot of sense to me and corroborated some of our own findings looking at similar kinds of programs in Central America, where we've been working with both at-risk and gang-involved youth. And I think there we used more of a three-legged stool, where we had both the hard skills of formal education, the soft skills of life skills, that sort of thing, but also the civic engagement. And what we found is it's a real challenge, especially when we do include the hard skills, not only for formal education, but also for employment, because livelihoods are really where most of the donors are pushing, because they have a working implicit theory of change, which is, if youth have greater access to employment opportunities or livelihood opportunities, then they're less prone to engage in violence. But really what I think we found from our own experience in doing our own research as well is that it is that civic engagement, that third leg of the stool, that's critical. But to me, that brings up a key question. I was trying to quickly skim the report to find out what's the profile of your participant, because in Central America, we were dealing both with those young people who were already involved in gang activities and also those who are at risk. And so that might have some influence on some of what you're finding there in Somaliland. The other point I wanted to raise is I noticed that this is all within the larger framework of the Somaliland government's countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism policy and strategy. And I have to say that raises some concerns for me. We're a faith-based nonprofit organization. We've signed on to the NGO Code of Conduct. For us, countering violent extremism runs up against some core principles of neutrality, impartiality. It also runs up against a more operational concern of do no harm, where it puts our staff, our partners, our participants potentially in harm's way. Maybe not so much in Somaliland, but especially as you're moving further south into Somalia proper. I was wondering how you might address some of those issues going forward. Thank you.
So for the first question, what is the profile of the participants? Essentially, we were just looking at the population that the program is targeting. So it's a program that's increasing access to secondary education. So it's targeting just youth generally across these communities, as Faisal mentioned, that were deemed vulnerable, that didn't have access to schools. I think somebody on the line has some background noise. Can you please mute your phones? Okay. So it was just targeting youth across the board in those communities where we were building schools. And then we were also looking at out-of-school youth. But again, we weren't targeting specifically young people that had engaged in violence or not. It was just generally looking at the communities and those in school and out of school and sort of comparing them. We did see that some people that we surveyed had participated in political violence, or they reported that they had participated in the past 12 months in some acts of political violence, and we left it sort of vague intentionally. So there were some young people that had, been engaged in violence, at least, that we were capturing. So there's some variation in those behaviors and perceptions. A second question about CV-EPV, I think Madeline would be best placed to answer it. But I mean, I would just say generally, our research, as you see, we talk about political violence, including violent extremism. So we sort of generally see the problem as more broader than violent extremism. We look at the issue in terms of violence generally, and specifically violence against the state or political violence. So yeah, that's in the way we framed our research, that's how we've addressed it. But that also relates to how we generally do our programming, and I'll let Madeline speak to that a bit more.
Yeah, and then I'll have Faisal close it out, speaking to kind of operationally how we actually talk about these things and the framing. And as an organization, we, like Faisal said, we view violent extremism as a form of political violence, and we believe that we have tools to mitigate all forms of violence, including political violence. We've talked about this for years within the agency about sort of, does that violate the NGO code of conduct? We don't think so. We think it's in our mission, state, and mandate to reduce the drivers of all forms of human suffering, and we think violent extremism and acts of violence by violent extremist organizations is causing, human suffering and backsliding of development progress. And so the sort of whole organization is on board with being willing to do these programs. But on framing globally, we think the better framing, and we're quite certain, all of our donors, private, public, institutional, whatever, that our frame that we prefer is violence reduction. Like you should be worried about reducing all forms of violence, and then give us as practitioners or as policymakers or your ambassadors on the ground, give them the latitude to work on whatever forms of violence in that particular context is the most egregious, whether it's intercommunal, political violence, whatever the form of violence is. So we're trying to, with AFP and with others, continue to move the policy frame away from preferential forms of violence that particular governments believe matter the most, and actually look at the facts of what are the biggest drivers of violence in the world, and how can we apply tools to reduce all forms of violence. And we follow a lot of the research on sort of the metastasization of different forms of violence. So intercommunal leads to gang violence often leads to violent extremism. So trying to bring it down to the lower level, the drivers. But certainly Faisal's perspective on how we message this on the ground and what the words we actually say is more valuable.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's a very relevant question. And when it comes to framing, when Beza and I were in Hargeisa asking some of the questions, we had a difficulty framing some of the questions. For example, asking them about Al-Shabaab, maybe something related to Al-Shabaab. It was kind of very. We were trying to come up in a smart way to ask and frame some of the questions, so that we don't run up into issues with the community. Because what allowed us to work that vast land, starting from Somaliland all the way to Kismayo, and construct schools, build partnership with communities, build that trust with the community and the government, is because we have been doing a development work. We have been working on a development program. We're going into communities telling them we're trying to provide education to your kids who don't have opportunity to go to school. That trust and partnership has allowed us to go deep into South Central Somalia, including recently liberated areas. For example, the emerging states, Jubaland, Southwest, and Hirshabelle, Galmudug, all those states. And the reason why we don't want to screw up that relationship with the community just because of the term we're using, maybe CVE. So our work is development-based. The program is development-based approach to prevent violence. As Madeline mentioned, violence, political violence, gang violence, clan violence, intercommunal violence. and by extension, CVE, or prevent violent extremism or counter-violent extremism. So it's very tricky, and when we're trying to get at some of the questions or maybe move to the south, we're trying to expand the study to the south where security is an issue. Framing those questions will be something that we need to put our heads together and come up with a very smart way of asking those questions without damaging that relationship we built throughout the years. So you're right, CVE is just one particular section of many other sections that we're focused on. Our development program is long-term investment, and the return of investment is actually a long-term. So that's how I would put the answer to that question. Actually, I think he was.
I was just going to say we have a few online remote callers who have a few questions that they typed out for you. And the first one is from Karen Greiner, who asks, could you speak more about the survey experiments and whether you use tools already available to ask questions about sensitive topics? In other words, did you have to develop your own instruments, or were they already available tools that you used that were more useful?
So for the survey experiment, we used a technique called the randomized response, and it's essentially you use a spinner to allow the respondent to decide, like he spins the spinner, it says like you either answer truthfully or you answer yes or you answer no. And because it's the respondent who sees what the spinner is telling them, they can sort of essentially feel more at ease because the interviewer is not going to know how they're responding, whether it's truthfully or whether they're following what the spinner is telling them. Anyways, this is a technique that has been developed through political science research around sensitive issues. And if you are interested in exploring it more, I would refer to Kusuke Ime and Jason Lyle. They have developed a lot of tools around this, including the random response, which we use, but also other survey experiments, including list experiments and endorsement experiments. And we've tried to use these as much as possible. And the one that worked for us the best was the random response.
Lisa Ann Blumos asked, you focus on secondary education. Do you think you would find similar results with regard to tertiary education? Do you plan to conduct studies around tertiary education, civic engagement, and the reduction of violence?
That's an interesting question.
Thanks.
So we use.
He is not. Excuse me. Caller on the online, please mute your mic. Thank you.
Get ready for your assessment.
Can you please mute your mic? Okay, so that's an interesting question. We looked at secondary education because that's what our program was providing, and I think that age range. So I mean, the program is targeting people between the ages of 15 and 24. I think that age range is very close to the age range for recruits into groups like Al-Shabaab. So it was, I guess, sort of the reason why we focus on that. Tertiary education, I have a feeling there's not a lot of students in tertiary educational institutions in Somaliland or Somalia. And we're not sure, I mean, I'll let Faisal speak to this, but I'm not sure if the vulnerability is quite as high there. But since we had conversations about this earlier, might actually be a group that is vulnerable.
You're right. You're right in that.
And last question that is typed out is from Waiting for Name. Did you look at addressing structural violence as opposed to direct violence? Are you measuring tools available for use by other researchers?
So we just looked at a very specific form of violence, like we mentioned, which is political violence and violent extremism. We didn't look at structural violence, I guess, or other forms of violence, simply because the main goal of this program was really focused on stability and reducing political violence and engagement in political violence amongst youth. And yes, yes, we'd be happy to share our tools with other researchers.
Yeah, I think he was ahead of you. So.
David Shen, George Washington University. How did you define and measure the terms supports use of political violence and used violence for political cause?
Sure. So it's just going to look at the annex because it was very specific. So the question about used political violence, we asked if the respondent had used force or violence for a political cause, and we actually looked at it within the last 12 months, was the specific question. And then the support political violence, we asked, do you believe it is sometimes necessary to use violence for a political cause?
So it was based on sort of how they responded to the question then.
Yeah, it was
and
self-reported.
You're taking them at their word on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a big limitation of our research. We don't have many other indicators for participation, so we rely on self-reports often. David, did you?
Yeah, sorry to jump in again. I'm getting a bit more bothered by the conflation of political violence and violent extremism as the conversation goes on. While we make the distinctions within a room like this, the policymakers don't tend to, and there's a real difference between, I would say, a very thin overlap in a Venn diagram between political violence and violent extremism. They can come from the same roots. They don't necessarily, and arguably don't often, come from the same roots, nor do they aspire to the same goals. So operation, going from, there's more of a research question. Operationally, my concern is that by terming violent extremism as a form of political violence, which I really disagree with, we are also providing the tools with which we're watching a series of governments around the planet crack down on political dissent, on political demonstration, because that nuance is lost that says there really is a difference, although there is some overlap. And we are placing political violence and even political demonstration, the ability for a government to interpret a demonstration as violent, into a set of rules that say, here is how you deal with that, that's actually based around what, typically speaking, governments do in order to crack down on extremist terrorist movements. And that's a very dangerous thing. So this may be a longer conversation than we have for now, but I would like to see more. If it's me, I'd like to see a lot more distinction between political violence and violent extremism, because I would disagree that they are. You can overlap them, as I'm afraid.
I have just one thought on that, and I'm sorry, but I think, this issue is because we don't really have a clear definition of violent extremism, So I think that's just one thing as a community of practice. We need to be more clear what exactly that is, and if it's different than political violence, what exactly makes it different. And the second thing is, I don't think, our research is not trying to condemn political opposition. And in fact, we're doing civic engagement activities. We want young people to be politically active and have a voice. But like Madeline was saying, our overall goal is to reduce violence. So we don't believe, even if it's a politically motivated act of violence, it's necessarily legitimate. But I guess that you're right, it's a much broader question, a philosophical question perhaps.
It gets pretty muddy as to if it causes drivers goals, aspirations of garden variety political violence versus garden variety violent extremism. I mean, you're right, we have no clear guidance on this, but there are certainly different philosophies, different goals, different hopes, different things that drive someone to become one direction or the other, although those can be overlapped.
Yeah.
And although certainly the goal of any of us in this room is simply prevent violence, it matters less where it's coming from than it does stop the killing. But that's a potential divergence in the causes, drivers, dynamics of violence that can be accountable for, say, violent extremism, political violence. Therefore,
Yeah. You're right. I think violent extremism and violence, I think it's an evolving field that we need to be very clear on what aspect of violence we are talking about. For us, what we focused mostly was violent extremism, while it's violence on its own, it's one small section of a larger violence that we're trying to address or to preempt. For example, political violence against the government, political violence against individuals, against the public, or maybe the population, or civilians. So political violence against civilians could be terrorism, political violence against government, it could be dissent, it could be other things, motivating. So in our case, we looked at, for example, how clan conflict is implicated into power sharing within the government structure, and how those communities, for example, specific communities perceive the government because of they're opposed to the government, because of they don't have equal share with other clans. So all those things, I think I agree with you completely that we need some clear definitions on each and every term that we're using. Can we generalize and say political violence, and then by extension other violences, clan violence, intercommunal violence, violent extremism? That's another question that also needs the practitioners and the people who are doing this kind of work to be very vocal about and come up with something very specific on it.
I also think, I think we have no evidence that countering violent extremism has promoted crackdowns on civil society. Counterterrorism has. So every government in the world has passed, when there's counterterrorism legislation, that has been used to, justify extrajudicial killings and roundups.
Governments don't make that distinction.
Well, the Somali government is one of the first governments in the entire world that has passed a national CVE, PVE strategy since the UN Secretary General's PVE action plan. It was one of two that's been passed. And it's 65 pages of promoting inclusion, access to education, civic engagement, opportunity, a more unified, educated, empowered, Somalia. So, and that's a distinction from their seat. That's a distinction from their CT laws. So I think I get what you're saying, but we don't actually have evidence that CVE has yet exacerbated the crackdowns that we're all collectively concerned with.
We need to check that. If they have, that would be an exception within a whole range of countries that do not make a distinction between CVE and CVE, or very thin and not well defined. So that's a great example, but that should be checked in future iterations of this, and it should be checked against other examples where that particular document does not exist. That, as far as I know, is a rarity.
Yes. So the political violence we looked at was the organized destructive acts committed outside of state control, motivated by desire to gain or maintain political power, distinguished from social and economic crimes, for example, robbery or domestic violence. And then we said here, in one of the research that we did, the one that's complementing this one, political violence is a more straightforward, though often misused. It's violence for a political purpose, and it can be against both combatants, militarians, armed governments, or against civilians. political violence against civilians is terrorism, which is misused the majority of the time, especially politicians and the media.
We do have one more question from one of our remote viewers. It's from Randy Tift, who asks, has this study influenced MercyCorps' position regarding how to engage official donors on CVE and prospects for getting those donors to shift framing to violence reduction?
I would say that's a live question since we just released it yesterday. But yeah, that's what we're hoping. So we're hoping that this continues to move the conversation towards evidence-based approaches to what actually reduces forms of violence and can help better concretize and anchor the CVE efforts within a smarter and more, sophisticated and drawn-out violence reduction agenda that would help us get to the question of, is it political, is it different, So there's been a lot of interest in it. We hope it's useful, but yeah, it's certainly, we very much did the study for ourselves and our learning, but very much to kind of answer the question that we've gotten from policymakers for years and years and years, like, can you prove conflict prevention? How can you prove it to us? So we hope it's a useful contribution to that conversation, but who knows?
And can I add, I feel confident that MercyCorps would welcome others to step forward and do the kind of evaluation work that they have done to put themselves out there so that others would also go into different kinds of environments and test different kinds of definitions so that we would have that broader learning in the community. But you guys get credit for what you did. I look forward to who else is stepping forward. Volunteer now. I am sort of, what Liz knows is that I am speaking as sort of from the realm of the consortium, the Peacebuilding Evaluation Consortium, which includes MercyCorps, Search for Common Ground, and CDA, Collaborative Learning. And there have been some attempts to get multiple different actors to do the same kind of research. And I guess I'll try to a little bit put words into MercyCorps' mouth of it seems that they have been somewhat disappointed that others have not stepped forward to do the same kinds of studies when that they thought that there would be more efforts like that. They don't mean to generalize from the whole world of Somalia. It's just a really good piece of work, and the expectation is that others will do the same kinds of things. If you need advice on methods and things, we have the Peacebuilding Evaluation Consortium that will be happy to help you with that.
Well, is that on? Partially addressed, but Mike Jagits from PAX Advisory and Alliance for Peacebuilding just published a couple books on of mine by criminalized power structures as the overlooked enemies of peace. But the question really gets to the nature of the regime. So what kinds of variables do you look at when you look at the drivers of conflict, and what drivers of conflict were you trying to solve in this case? But specifically, the nature of the regime. Would this theory of change be relevant and applicable everywhere, or in a place like Syria, where people attempted nonviolent opposition and we know what the results were? So the question, though, has to do with you started in Somaliland, but you're going to be expanding this to other places in Somalia where the nature of the regime may vary. So I would expect that you probably, maybe this is a hypothesis that you could test. The nature of the regime may have an impact, especially if it's a kleptocratic regime that's inclined toward repression. That may not be what you confront, but that you may find something along that scale where your results might be influenced by that particular variable.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I think we always try to contextualize the research. So obviously, Somaliland and Somalia, even though Somaliland is part of Somalia is very different. The regime there is one that's been democratically elected. Over the years, they've had a lot of experiences with an open participatory system. It's largely peaceful. In the south, they're just transitioning into something more democratic. They're supposed to have their elections this week. It's still not completely open to the public to vote, but there are efforts to democratize the system there as well. And Faisal will know much more about this than I do. I think our aim, though, is to test how much these hypotheses that we have apply in different contexts. So we sort of want to ask the same questions and see how much we can generalize about these findings in other places. And I think the move from Somaliland to Somalia is probably the most similar context. We might also look at Kenya or other countries in that region. But yeah, if we were to replicate this study in Syria or Iraq, we might come up with completely different conclusions. And I think that's our goal, is to understand to what extent can we generalize these findings. And yeah, so that's our approach.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, because some of the variables may change, the context will change, and of course some of the findings may change. For example, providing education may not change, providing civic engagement may not change. And the underlying assumption is that if you provide, if we don't provide education and civic engagement, or without civic engagement, youth may feel isolated or less empowered. And if they are feeling disconnected from their families, from their communities, they will most likely get that sense of belonging from somewhere else, from external forces, negative external forces. Could be political group, could be gang group, could be elsewhere. So that sense of satisfaction and connectedness within the community is always some of the things that we advocate for. But in Somalia, they might be slightly different, but in most cases, like my colleague just mentioned, the context is similar. That except that the violence has been going on in the south for a longer period of time. In other contexts, and how to generalize this, we may need to also have our partners here to do some kind of this work, like our colleague just said. I think the community of practice then comes together with a holistic findings that can lead us into something that we can generalize across all different environments.
To say on the issue of state, the role of state, I think that's somewhere where third-party, where partnerships with operational organizations and outside researchers like Georgetown and GW are so vital, because I think we have pushed the limits of what we can say around the role of the state. So in our sort of big study, Youth and Consequences, that came out in 2015, we said, one of the largest drivers to violent extremism is state violence. And state violence perpetrated by the state against civilians is consistently one of the largest predictors of support for violence. That's a lot of what our principles as practitioners of good governance is like facilitating constructive opportunities for citizens and state to work together to solve problems. There's only so far we can go on like researching the role. So I think it's something that's coming up. It's coming up a lot in our research. We're really frustrated about the constraints of our ability to talk about things that we see and talk about the connections between different forms of violence. And I think we all need to think creatively about how we can align. So, we've worked with the University of Maryland, where they're pushing out big surveys on exposure to violence and drivers to violence and state violence, and trying to incorporate some of their findings into our advocacy messages, into the way we design programs, but we can't come out and say things in a way that a researcher would. So I think that we as a community of practice, as like practitioners and academics, really need to come up with creative ways to align our research and advocacy agendas, recognizing the limits of who can say what.
Hi, I'm Katie from Search for Common Ground. I just had a quick question about, did you look at in the study between the formal education and opportunities for civic engagement, did you also look into like if there was response from their civic engagement from the state, like whether it was from a leader or from the community or from a group, if there was kind of this, either they replied back or there was some sort of closing of the feedback loop. Because like in the same way we were talking about how formal education creates expectations and expectations not met then lead to grievances, I think that there's a risk for that same kind of expectation coming from what you think may come from civic engagement. So I was curious if that was something you considered.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We engage the Ministry of Education at the federal level, but also we engage at the district level and at the regional level. So all our activities are joint activities that we do with the community leaders, government officials that are relevant, for example, Ministry of Education officials. We provide training for them and we engage them because we want at the end of the day to build that trust between the community and the government, and those services continue. What happened is that when we launched the civic engagement program as a pilot program in some of the schools that we support, they sustained those efforts, and we have noticed that there are differences within the communities that we targeted with education and civic engagement. And it has become part of the school routine. Like they come up with an action plan. They will say we will clean the school, or maybe we will come up with planting trees within the school, or we will conduct an activity within a particular community, a very poor community. They do some activities. So that has led to the government officials, not only government officials, community leaders realize that. And they say, yes, this is something that's working. This is something that we see, because there has not been a history of civic engagement in Somalia. None before. It's a new phenomenon. It's a new thing that came. So what basically happened was that by talking to these students who were really satisfied and taking actions on their own, has motivated them. And what we did basically now, what we're doing in this few months coming, is to look at the federal, the national curriculum to include some civic components so that we can institutionalize and they can stay there. They can have a lasting impact for a longer period of time, even when we are not there. They can still continue because they're part of the curriculum, they're taught at school, and it's something that's happening all the time. So those are the kind of things that led us to engage the community, the government, and come up with a holistic approach to sustain those efforts.